January 1945. Somewhere in the frost-edged fields of eastern France, the medical tent stood alone, against a sky the color of ash and snow. Inside, kerosene lamps cast trembling shadows across canvas walls stained with mud and dried blood. The air smelled of iodine, wool, and the metallic tang of fear. Captain James Holbrook, a 32-year-old Army surgeon from Ohio, knelt beside a narrow cot where a figure lay wrapped in gray Wehrmacht wool, breathing shallow and quick. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery had become so constant it felt like the Earth's own heartbeat, a pulse of war that never quite stopped. The figure on the cot was small. Too small, Holbrook thought, for the uniform that hung loose around narrow shoulders. When the medics brought this prisoner in face pale, legs shattered by shrapnel, no one had looked closely. Another German soldier. Another casualty in a war grown so vast that individual suffering had become mere arithmetic. But when Holbrook cut away the blood-soaked trouser leg and began cleaning the wound, his hands stilled. The skin beneath was smooth, unmarked by the coarse hair typical of young men. The bone structure too delicate. The shape of the chest, even beneath layers of binding cloth. Undeniable. This wounded enemy soldier was a woman. She watched him with eyes the color of winter, rivers gray-blue, and full of something beyond fear. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of weary resignation. She knew he knew. In that moment, in the flickering lamplight of a makeshift field hospital, two people from opposite sides of history's greatest conflict locked gazes. And something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared humanity in a world that had worked so hard to erase it. Holbrook said nothing. He simply continued his work, setting the broken femur, cleaning the wound, administering morphine from their dwindling supply. And as the drug took hold and her breathing steadied, she whispered 5 words in heavily accented English that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Don't tell my sister." I tried to understand what brought a young German woman to die slowly in a French medical tent wearing the uniform of the Wehrmacht. We must travel backward through the architecture of desperation that the Third Reich constructed around its women, and forward through the mythology it fed them. By January 1945, Germany was a nation consuming itself. The 1,000-year Reich that Hitler promised had lasted barely 12. And now it was collapsing inward like a dying star. The Eastern Front had become a cemetery stretching from Stalingrad to the Vistula. The Western Allies were grinding through the Ardennes, having broken the back of Germany's last great offensive. German cities burned nightly under waves of Allied bombers. Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin itself transformed into landscapes of rubble and ash. The Wehrmacht, once a seemingly invincible war machine, was now a skeleton crew of old men, young boys, and increasingly, those the regime had spent years telling to stay home and bear children. Women had always been central to Nazi ideology, but only in carefully prescribed roles. The regime's propaganda celebrated them as mothers, as keepers of racial purity, as the biological foundation of Aryan supremacy. The party's slogan, Kinder, Kuch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, defined their universe. Hitler himself declared in 1934 that the woman's world is her husband, her family, her children, and her home. This was not merely social preference, but ideological imperative. In the Nazi vision, German women would outbreed the inferior races, filling the Reich with pure-blooded soldiers and future mothers. But ideology bends when survival is at stake. By 1944, with casualties mounting and manpower collapsing, the Reich began conscripting women into roles previously unthinkable. Not combat, never officially combat, but everything adjacent to it. Women served as anti-aircraft auxiliaries, manning the flak batteries that defended German cities. They worked in communications, in logistics, in intelligence. They drove trucks, operated radios, maintained aircraft. The Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Reich Labor Service, had been mobilizing women since 1939, But by war's end, over 500,000 served in the Wehrmacht auxiliaries alone. They wore uniforms. They took orders. They lived under military discipline, and some, when the need grew desperate enough and the ideological walls thin enough, found themselves handed rifles and told to fight. Historical records suggest that thousands of German women saw combat in the war's final months, though exact numbers remain elusive. The Reich never officially admitted women into combat roles. To do so would have been to admit that the masculine ideal of Aryan warrior supremacy had failed. But field reports from both Eastern and Western fronts document women among captured prisoners, women found dead in Wehrmacht uniforms, women defending Berlin's rubble with Panzerfausts in April 1945. They were often listed in official documents as auxiliary personnel or simply not recorded at all. The regime preferred they remain invisible. Even in death, the woman on Captain Holbrook's table was one of these invisible soldiers. Her name, Holbrook would later learn from identity papers sewn into her uniform lining, was Greta Muller. She was 23 years old. Born in Stuttgart in 1921, she had come of age as the Nazi Party consolidated power, as Hitler's voice became the only voice permitted to speak for Germany's future. She would have been 12 when the regime began systematically excluding Jews from public life. 15 when Kristallnacht shattered Jewish shops and synagogues across Germany. 18 when the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland and the world caught fire. The records Holbrook found offered no details about her life before the uniform, no letters. No photographs, only the bureaucratic fragments of a wartime existence. But we can reconstruct the world that shaped her from the experiences of thousands like her. Young German women in the 1930s were saturated in Nazi propaganda from childhood. The Bund Deutscher Mägde, the League of German Girls, enrolled millions, teaching them ideology disguised as culture, obedience dressed up as community service. They learned that Germany had been betrayed in 1918, stabbed in the back by Jews and communists and weak-willed politicians. They learned that the Versailles Treaty was a humiliation that must be avenged. They learned that their bodies were not their own but belonged to the Volk, that their highest calling was to produce children for the fatherland. And they learned that Germany was destined to dominate Europe, to create a new order built on racial purity and German supremacy. For young women like Greta, the war's early years must have felt like vindication. Poland fell in weeks. France, which had humiliated Germany in 1918, collapsed in 40 days. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, and the regime's promises of greatness appeared to be manifesting before their eyes. German newsreels showed smiling soldiers distributing bread in occupied territories, showed grateful populations welcoming their new masters, showed the Führer as architect of a new European civilization. The suffering of those conquered, the Jews herded into ghettos, the Poles subjected to brutal occupation policies. The systematic erasure of entire communities was invisible in this propaganda, or justified as necessary for the greater good. Women had always been central to Nazi ideology, but only in carefully prescribed roles. The regime's propaganda celebrated them as mothers, as keepers of racial purity, as the biological foundation of Aryan supremacy. The party's slogan, Kinder, Kuch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, defined their universe. Hitler himself declared in 1934 that the woman's world is her husband, her family, her children, and her home. This was not merely social preference, but ideological imperative. In the Nazi vision, German women would outbreed the inferior races, filling the Reich with pure-blooded soldiers and future mothers. But ideology bends when survival is at stake. But by 1943, the narrative was cracking. Stalingrad became a name that could not be spoken without grief. The Afrika Korps surrendered. Italy, Germany's Axis partner, collapsed and switched sides. The Reich began conscripting younger and younger men, then older men, then men previously considered unfit. Factories ran day and night, producing weapons that disappeared into the insatiable maw of a two-front war. Food rations shrank. Casualty lists grew, and the women of Germany were told once again to serve. For Greta Muller, that service began according to fragmentary records in late 1943, when she volunteered for the Nachrichtenfeldern, the Wehrmacht Communications Auxiliaries. She would have operated radios, decoded messages, maintained the tenuous threads of communication that held German units together. It was vital work, but safely behind the lines. Proper work for a woman, the regime insisted, even as it dressed her in field gray and subjected her to military discipline. But something changed. Whether from ideological fervor, personal loss, or simple circumstance, by autumn 1944, Greta Muller had been transferred to a combat unit as it retreated through France. The exact unit remains unclear. Records from this period are fragmentary, deliberately obscured or destroyed. What matters is that when American forces overran a German defensive position near the French-German border in early January 1945, they found her among the casualties, wearing a Wehrmacht uniform, carrying a Karabiner 98K rifle with 2 rounds remaining in the magazine. She had been, in every sense that mattered, a soldier. Captain Holbrook worked on Greta's shattered leg for 3 hours. The femur had broken in 2 places, and shrapnel had shredded muscle tissue. In a proper surgical theater with adequate supplies, he might have saved the leg. Here, in a tent that smelled of gangrene and canvas rot, with instruments sterilized over kerosene flames and morphine running low, he did what he could. He set the bone, cleaned the wound, applied sulfa powder, and wrapped the leg in bandages that had been washed and reused so many times they felt more like rags than medical supplies. She remained conscious through much of it, though the morphine dulled the worst pain. She didn't cry out. She watched him work with that same steady, exhausted gaze, as if she had already moved beyond fear into some country where pain was simply another fact, like cold or hunger. When he finished, Holbrook sat back on his heels and looked at her properly. Without the blood and mud, her face was younger than the war had made her. High cheekbones, a thin mouth set in a line that might have been determination or simply habit. Her hair, cut short and matted with sweat, was the color of dark honey. She could have been any young woman in any American town, a clerk in a department store, a schoolteacher, someone's sister or daughter. "You'll live," he said quietly, though he wasn't certain she understood English. "The leg is bad, but you'll live." She blinked slowly, processing his words. Then, in that accented but clear English, "Why?" Holbrook didn't have an answer. He was a doctor. She was wounded. The Hippocratic Oath didn't include exemptions for enemy combatants, regardless of gender. But he understood what she was really asking. Why save her when her own army would have shot her for being captured? When her existence violated every principle the regime claimed to uphold? When the simplest thing would have been to let her slip away into the darkness that waited at the edges of the lamplight? "Because it's what we do," he said finally. It wasn't eloquent, but it was true. She absorbed this in silence. Then, with effort, she spoke again. Her voice was weak, each word purchased with pain. "In Germany, they told us Americans were weak, soft, that you fight for money and machines, not for anything real. That you have no culture, no history, no soul. Only products and commerce." Holbrook had heard similar things from other prisoners. It was a common thread in German propaganda, the Americans as culturally bankrupt materialists, spiritually inferior to the Germanic warrior ideal. The irony, sitting here in a tent lit by American kerosene, using American medical supplies, treating wounds inflicted by American artillery, seemed lost on no one. "And what do you think now?" he asked. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were wet. "I think they lied about many things. It was then, as Holbrook prepared to move to the next patient, that she reached out with her uninjured hand and gripped his wrist. Her fingers were cold, trembling. She pulled him closer, and he leaned in to hear her whisper, "Don't tell my sister." "I tried." "Tried what?" Holbrook asked gently. "To believe. To serve. To make it mean something." Her voice broke. "She stayed home, married, had a baby. She was right. This—" She gestured weakly at her broken body, at the tent, at the war beyond. "This was for nothing." Greta Muller died 3 days later. Not from the leg wound, which Holbrook thought she might survive, but from infection. Even with sulfa drugs, even with the best care a field hospital could provide, the bacteria found her weakened body and spread through her bloodstream like rumors through a frightened population. She developed a fever on the 2nd day. By the 3rd, she was delirious, speaking in German about her sister, about Stuttgart, about things Holbrook couldn't understand. She died just before dawn on January 20th, 1945. As snow began to fall on the frozen fields of France, Holbrook wrote her death in the log as unidentified German auxiliary personnel. Female, approximately 23 years old. He included her real name in a separate report, along with the identity papers and the detail that she had been carrying a rifle. The report went up the chain of command and disappeared into the vast bureaucratic machinery of war. Whether Greta's sister in Stuttgart ever learned her fate remains unknown. Most likely, Greta simply became another of the millions who vanished into the war's vast, uncaring appetite, gone, forgotten, erased. But Holbrook didn't forget. Decades later, in interviews conducted by military historians, he would speak about Greta Muller as a turning point in his understanding of the war. She was a victim, he said, but also a perpetrator. She was a soldier in an army that had committed unimaginable atrocities, yet she was also a young woman who had been fed lies her entire life and asked to die for them. Both things were true. War doesn't give you the luxury of simple moral categories. What struck him most, he said, was the contrast between what Greta had been taught to expect and what she actually experienced when she encountered American forces. The propaganda had told her Americans were weak, decadent, unworthy opponents. Untermensch, almost subhuman in their materialism and cultural poverty. They lacked the spiritual depth of Germans, the warrior ethos, the willingness to sacrifice for transcendent ideals. Instead, she found a doctor who worked 3 hours to save the life of an enemy combatant. She found medical supplies in abundance, not infinite, but more than the Wehrmacht could muster for its own troops. She found soldiers who followed rules about prisoner treatment, who didn't execute her for being female or fighting in violation of gender norms. She found, in other words, a civilization that could afford mercy because it was built on systems robust enough to include mercy as policy, not merely as individual kindness. This was the great secret the Nazi ideology couldn't accommodate, that liberal democracy, with all its messy pluralism and commercial values and supposed spiritual poverty, produced societies capable of extraordinary care even for their enemies. That American materialism meant American factories could supply not just their own forces, but their allies, could produce enough medical supplies that a German enemy could receive life-saving surgery. That American weakness for individual rights meant even enemy prisoners received treatment as human beings rather than disposable resources. The Reich had taught Greta that strength meant sacrifice. That virtue lay in suffering for the collective. That greatness required subordinating individual needs to the state's vision. And here, at the end, she discovered that the supposedly weak, decadent Americans could offer her something her own side never had: the recognition that her life, even her enemy life, had intrinsic worth. "Don't tell my sister." I tried. The words haunt because they reveal the tragedy at the heart of totalitarian systems. Greta tried. She believed. She served. She sacrificed her body and ultimately her life for a cause the regime told her was righteous and transcendent. And in the end, dying in an enemy hospital, she recognized it had been for nothing. The ideology was hollow. The promises were lies. The sacrifices were wasted, but she didn't want her sister to know. Perhaps because knowing would poison whatever small happinesses her sister had built in the ruins of Germany. Perhaps because she wanted someone in her family to believe the sacrifice had meaning, even if she no longer could. Perhaps because the final gift she could give was to bear the weight of that disillusionment alone. The records show that approximately 500,000 German women served in Wehrmacht auxiliaries by war's end, with thousands more in other military capacities. Exact numbers remain contested, deliberately obscured by a regime that couldn't admit its ideology of gender had failed as completely as its military strategy. What we know is that German women operated anti-aircraft batteries that killed Allied airmen, worked in communications networks that coordinated Wehrmacht operations, served in logistics chains that supplied combat units. They were part of the machinery of war, willing or unwilling, ideological or simply trying to survive. And when the Reich collapsed in May 1945, they faced a reckoning. In the Soviet occupation zone, German women, military and civilian, experienced systematic sexual violence on a scale that defies comprehension. In the Western zones, treatment varied, but female Wehrmacht auxiliaries often faced harsher judgment than their male counterparts, as if their violation of gender norms was a greater crime than the regime's violation of humanity. Greta Muller was in some ways fortunate. She died quickly, tended by an enemy doctor who saw her as a patient rather than a symbol. She never faced the mass expulsions, the starvation winters, the ruined cities of post-war Germany. She never had to reconcile what she had believed with what had actually happened, never had to explain to her sister why she had volunteered for a war machine that devoured everything it touched. She simply died, whispering an apology for having tried and failed to make evil mean something. Captain James Holbrook returned to Ohio in August 1946. He resumed his medical practice. Married, raised 3 children, lived a quiet life that from the outside looked like it had nothing to do with war. But in a drawer in his study, he kept Greta Muller's identity papers, carefully preserved in a folder labeled only with a date, January 20th, 1945. He never tried to contact her sister. He never knew if her sister survived the war, if the baby she'd been caring for lived, if the family home in Stuttgart still stood after the Allied bombing campaigns that reduced German cities to rubble. But he kept the papers. And sometimes, late at night, he would take them out and look at the photograph, a young woman with serious eyes and a half-smile, taken before the war had carved suffering into her face. He would think about the moment she gripped his wrist and whispered her confession, her apology, her plea for silence. He would think about what it meant that she spent her last conscious moments worried not for herself but for her sister's peace of mind. She was trying to protect someone she loved from the truth, he told an interviewer in 1982, 3 years before his death. That's what made her human. Not the uniform she wore or the side she fought for, but that instinct to shield someone else from pain. We spend so much time thinking about soldiers as warriors, as killers, as representatives of nations and ideologies. We forget they're also daughters, sisters, people who love and worry and regret. Greta Muller was a Nazi soldier. She was also a woman who died asking me to lie to her sister, so her sister could keep believing the sacrifice had meaning. I've spent 40 years trying to reconcile those two facts. He never could. Perhaps that's the point. War doesn't offer reconciliation. It offers only the raw fact of human complexity, that people can believe terrible things and still be capable of love. That ideologies can poison entire nations while individual moments of grace persist in the margins. That the difference between victim and perpetrator is often a matter of circumstance rather than character. In the tent that January morning, as Greta Muller's breathing slowed and finally stopped, Holbrook noticed something he hadn't seen before. Around her neck, beneath the layers of uniform and binding cloth, she wore a small silver locket. He opened it carefully. Inside were 2 photographs, each the size of a postage stamp. One showed a woman who might have been Greta's sister, same cheekbones, similar eyes, holding an infant. The other showed 2 young girls, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing in front of a house with flowers blooming in window boxes. They were smiling. Holbrook closed the locket and left it around her neck. When they buried her later that day in the frozen ground near the field hospital, it went with her. Whoever she had been, whoever she had loved, whoever had loved her, that small circle of silver was the only evidence that remained. The war would end 4 months later. The Reich would collapse into ruins and mass graves, into revelations of atrocities so vast they would redefine humanity's understanding of evil. The trials would come, the reckonings, the long, slow process of rebuilding. Germany would be divided, occupied, transformed. The women who had served the Wehrmacht would mostly disappear into silence, their service erased or minimized. Their stories judged too complicated, too uncomfortable, too ambiguous for the neat narratives nations prefer. But in a frozen field in France, on a January morning in 1945, one young German woman died, whispering an apology for having believed, for having tried, for having worn a uniform and carried a rifle in service of a lie she was only beginning to recognize as such. And an American doctor who could have let her die instead spent 3 hours trying to save her life. Because in that moment, the ideology didn't matter. The uniforms didn't matter. What mattered was the simple, stubborn fact of shared humanity, fragile, persistent, refusing to be erased even by history's greatest effort to divide the world into us and them. Human and inhuman, worthy and unworthy of mercy. Don't tell my sister. I tried. 70 years later, the words still echo. Not as an excuse or absolution, but as a reminder that every soldier, every casualty, every name in the endless lists of the dead was a person who loved someone, who worried about something, who carried into death not just their wounds, but their regrets. Greta Muller was a Nazi soldier. She was also a sister who wanted to protect someone she loved from the truth of wasted suffering. Both things are true. Both things will always be true, and in their tension lies the terrible complexity of war. Not good versus evil in clean narrative lines, but human beings on all sides, tangled in ideologies they barely understood, dying for causes that meant everything or nothing depending on the angle of the light. The tent is long gone now, dissolved back into canvas and memory. The frozen field has thawed and frozen 1,000 times since. But somewhere in the bureaucratic records of the U.S. Army, in a folder marked with a date, Greta Muller's identity papers still testify to a moment when an enemy became a patient, when a soldier became a woman, when a war that demanded everything paused just long enough for mercy to slip through. That is what she tried to tell him. That is what he spent the rest of his life trying to understand. That is what we inherit, not the ideology or the uniforms, but the weight of knowing that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual moments of grace persisted, fragile, insufficient, but refusing, absolutely refusing, to be extinguished. The locket went into the ground. The memory remains. And somewhere in Stuttgart, if she survived, a sister perhaps never learned what her sibling whispered in a medical tent as snow fell on the ruins of the Reich. Perhaps that was mercy too, not the whole truth, but the kindest version of it. The version that let someone keep believing, just a little longer, that suffering could mean something. That trying had been enough, that it wasn't enough. The war taught that lesson in blood and ash. But the trying itself, that stubborn, futile, utterly human refusal to stop caring, even when caring had become impossible, that remains. It has to. Because without it, without that last whispered plea for someone else's peace, there is only the machinery of war and the cold arithmetic of the dead.